Hi, and welcome back to Faster Futures from Silicon Valley. I'm Ron Morris, Director of Omnis Education San Francisco. Faster Futures from Silicon Valley is about helping you better understand innovation through lessons and conversations led by our two innovation experts and co-hosts, JC Velton and Mark Bunger. It's also about demystifying what it is to really work in innovative fields by inviting guests to come share their insights and experience. As a reminder, we begin with a short talk with our experts, and that should last about 15 minutes. Then we have a conversation with our guest, which lasts about 30 minutes, and we finish with 15 minutes of Q&A with you. So it's very important for you to write down your questions in the chat messages here on YouTube. This is our third installment of Faster Futures from Silicon Valley. Last month, we explored the future of robotics with Todd Meany of Facebook Robotics. And in our first episode, we discussed the essence of innovation and moonshots with JC and Mark. And we've given you some frameworks to think about innovation. And I think that these two episodes are really great in terms of laying down the framework, but also providing contrast with today's talk. If you would like to see the previous episodes, you can do so by subscribing to our YouTube channel, which you'll find here below. And so today, as I said, there's going to be a little bit of contrast. We're moving from robotics to something entirely organic. We're going to be discussing the future of biotech, which in itself is a moonshot, but not out to space, but to the core of all living matter here on Earth. So it's something that I think we're all really interested in. And we are very pleased to introduce you to a special guest today. Her name is Pae Wu of IndieBio. But first, I'm going to hand it over to Mark and JC, and for them to kick off our lesson of the day. Hi, guys. How you doing?
Hello. Great, thanks, Ron. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited by this talk because when you say it involves all living matter on Earth, that's quite a wide sweep. So this is going to be exciting.
Yeah, I find it to be the most exciting topic out there, and it's not just because of some sort of spiritual connection to living things, but also the biosphere, as it's sometimes called, is actually the thing that's most influencing the geosphere. So the non-living things are also very interrelated with life and technology. And so it's interesting to see those fields come together. So this has actually become kind of my passion topic. So it's been the focus of my career for about the last 15 or 17 years. And so I'm really happy to be sharing some introductory things with you before we talk with our guest, Pae. So let me share my screen. Okay, these slides are visible. Yes, thumbs up.
Yep.
All right, great. So as we've been talking about, today's topic is the future of bioengineering. First, I'll give about 15 minutes just as an overview, how this is a fundamental human activity, even though we think of it as something that's new and really cutting edge, and it is in many, many ways. It's also something that is really core to what it even means to be a human. We'll talk about the revolution that's going on right now, what's important right now, and what's gotten us here, and what's going to happen next. And some specific things that you might have heard about in that space. So you might have heard about CRISPR or synthetic biology or genetically modified organisms. So we're going to talk about some of those technical tools, but put that in in the context of business or of your career. So not just something for scientists and engineers, but something for everybody. The applications of that. So that's things like obviously the environment, but also food and fuels and medicine materials. And as part of that business thing, we'll be talking with Pae Wu, who is from IndieBio. IndieBio is a venture investment firm, but unlike a lot of other firms, they really take a very active role in helping generally scientists who have a good idea or a new discovery, turn that into a product that can benefit humans or the environment or companies, lots of different things. And so she'll talk about her role in that, but also how she got there, what some of the things that excite her are, and what this all says about innovation more broadly. So, like I said, biotechnology is actually our first technology. It's really primal to what it means to be human. If you were a human thousands of years ago and you saw some poisonous flowers or hungry wolves or rotten grapes, you probably shied away from them. You might have thought, okay, this can make me sick, this can kill me, this is dangerous. But some curious humans actually took the time to cultivate those things, to breed them, to discover processes like fermentation, and turn all these things that used to kill us into things that we need and love. And so even though the original organisms that these things were derived from are not at all or maybe barely recognizable in what we see today, the essence of them, that core part, is still there. And that's what really the process of going from science to engineering and then even to business and culture and our everyday life is all about. We identify something in the environment, we make a discovery, so it's not something that we invent first. We learn something, then we do learn how to apply that to a particular problem. Like those poisonous flowers in certain circumstances can actually help us recover from an even worse disease. Or those wolves, if we're nice to them and get them little bits of food and kind of train them, over time, they can become our friends, our allies, our pets, and really help us do a lot of things. And then, food, there's lots of ways to find food, but there's even more ways to make the food that we find into different types of meals and nutritional things, and even experiences like, bubbly champagne. So this process of making a discovery, understanding what's at the core of that new thing, and then learning to do it at scale, and even make a business out of it, is what engineering and then commercialization of innovations is all about. So you do need to know a little bit of the process, that the science behind all of those innovations to, I think, understand where it is now and where it's going. And while I don't expect everyone to walk away from here with a complete understanding of biochemistry, the basics are actually pretty simple to understand. You've all seen this double-stranded helix, DNA. It looks like a ladder that somebody twisted. And you can think of each one of those rungs on the ladder as a pair of their special chemicals, and they're abbreviated with A, T, C, and G. But you can think of those as like the ones and zeros in computer code. And just the same way that computer code doesn't work by, for example, one being long and skinny shape and a zero being round shape. It works by the meaning of those numbers. The meaning of these codes in DNA is what basically tells your body or any living organism how to create parts that give it certain abilities. So you might have heard about things like, the gene for a certain eye color or the gene for height. So sometimes genes, these little codes, do give very specific characteristics and properties. So for example, there are plants that have the ability to repel pests. They have a gene that makes a substance, it codes for a substance that poisons certain types of bugs. And one of the first commercial products in genetic engineering was taking that gene out of the plants that have that organism or that gene and putting it into plants that don't. So now plants that we grow as crops don't need to be sprayed with pesticide because they make their own pesticide to repel that bug. And this idea of taking these bits of code and really just copy pasting them from one organism to the next, that's what most of genetic engineering was about until pretty recently. And so whereas evolution changed those genes, one by one, slowly over millions of years, or even thousands, or even tens of years, sometimes evolution goes really rapidly. Engineering now means that we can do these things that would have taken a very long time, very rapidly and at scale. We can do millions of experiments, changing one or two letters, and just seeing what happens. That's been genetic engineering up to now, is sort of guessing, shotgun approach, making a mess and seeing, taking the best of what's left. but more and more we're able to forward engineer, to predict if we make this change, this is the property or the ability that we're likely to get out of that change. And so when we talk about genetic engineering with CRISPR or synthetic biology or things like that, it really is just this. It's changing that code of life and then applying that into new organisms that have a lot of other types of codes that it can be applied with. And basically taking, you know, the organisms that we like and giving them abilities that are closer to the ones that we want. So some specific areas where that's been applied. Well, in 1953 was when the structure of DNA was discovered. And this was about the time also that we were learning that DNA was the carrier of this information from generation to generation. People had really not understood exactly what was doing that job, if it was proteins or DNA or something else. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, a lot of progress was made in understanding that. And by the 80s, we had our first genetically engineered drug, and that was human insulin. So if you were diabetic up until that point, diabetes is a condition where your body doesn't make enough insulin, and so you get sugar spikes and ultimately can lead to losing limbs and blindness and even death. And so having a good replacement for the insulin that we had at the time, which was basically harvested from cadavers or from animals, was a really big breakthrough. What we basically did is took the human gene for insulin and put it into microbes. And so those microbes you can grow in a vat and make as much insulin as you ever would want. And so this is really key to basically the transformation of diabetes from a death sentence into something that is a manageable condition that you can live a long and pretty normal life with. So when you think about, genetically modified organisms, are they dangerous? Are they scary? Should they be forbidden? Just remember that we've been injecting millions of people with genetically engineered drugs for several decades now. In the 90s, the first genetically engineered crops came around. So I mentioned this idea of taking a pesticide resistance gene from one organism and putting it into crops. And that was really what was done there. Not having to spray the environment with pesticides and having an alternative, that's got some obvious benefits. And so right now, for certain crops like cotton and corn and soybeans, a large percentage of those crops that are grown with genetically modified versions today. So these were really simple transformations. You're taking one gene generally from one organism and putting it in another. But by the early 2000s, we had a map of all of the human DNA, all the genes in the human genome, which is thousands and thousands of genes. And we're still learning how they interact. At the time, people thought, once we have this map, we'll know everything we need to know about biology. And that turned out to not be the case at all, which is actually a good thing. We have a lot more questions, a lot more things to explore. But some of the things that have been really happening since then as a result of the Human Genome Project have been, one, gene synthesis. So we're not just copying a gene from one organism and putting it in another. We're learning how to make genes from scratch, sort of rather than cutting out existing genes. We can now sort of type them instead of doing copy and paste. We have access to the keyboard too. There's been an explosion of groups that we call biohackers, or everybody calls biohackers. Very, very similar to computer hackers. They're taking things that used to be very difficult to get, difficult to use, difficult to understand in terms of equipment and materials and so on, and doing them in hacker spaces, in their kitchens, in schools. So iGEM is a competition among high school students and also college students around the world to create genetically engineered organisms. It stands for the International Genetically Engineered Machines Competition. DIY Bio, Do-It-Yourself Bio. This is a group of biohackers that share ideas and recipes for things, like how to make certain plants or do other types of things, grow organisms for their own cheese and stuff. JOGL stands for Just One Giant Lab. That's actually based in Paris for those of you who are in France, and I would encourage you to check them out. We have a list, by the way, of links that we'll pass out with the slides here. Biocurious, Odin, these are some other, again, kind of favorite places for people who are curious about biology to learn more. We've had a number of precision gene editing techniques. So the copy paste and other types of techniques I mentioned earlier were, they were hard to control. And so basically what you had to do was do a lot of them and just keep the stuff that actually worked, because most of it wouldn't work out. CRISPR and a couple of other techniques are a lot more precise. So they allow you to do really precision transformations, and they are, it's also a technique that's very, very easy to do. So it's something that has basically even entered high school science curricula at this point. As I said, the Human Genome Project was not the end of all research into genetics or DNA or biology. The big areas that we found that are beyond the genome that are also important are called the proteome, the metabolome, the microbiome. And these are basically all about the things that happen after DNA has done its work. So it makes proteins. How those interact is called the proteome. Proteins then make other things like hormones, for example, and that's the metabolome, those metabolites. And then the microbiome is how our bodies, or how lots of bodies interact with microbes. So there are bacteria everywhere, and in our bodies, on our skin, in the air. And what we're finding out is that those separate individual organisms actually influence a lot about how we feel, how the environment works, and lots of other stuff. So that kind of gets us up to where we are today. And the commercialization of these types of products has been a huge success. So if you look at the use of insulin, for example, as I mentioned, the insulin analogs, these are basically evolved versions of human insulin that have been engineered to be even more effective than the insulin that we're born with. And this is becoming more and more common, basically, almost taking over the market entirely. With genetically modified crops, as I mentioned, these have also become very popular because they save farmers money. They're easier to grow. They have a lot of advantages. So there's nothing being there's not a mandate to do these things. These are really market driven. And if we look at why that's happening, and both environmental and financial reasons for that, we can see how that might affect other types of products. So to prepare ourselves for that conversation, what's happening next? What are some of the things that might follow this same trajectory from the 90s or the 2000s until today? What's at that point right now where it's just entering the market? Some of those things are going to run into regulations and bioethical conversations. A lot of people feel strongly that we shouldn't do GMOs. A lot of people feel that genes shouldn't be patented. I actually think that gene patenting has gone a little bit overboard. There are things that shouldn't really be granted a patent, but they have. And then there's all these rationales. Is genetically modified organisms, are they good for the environment or are they bad? Are they good economically for farmers or are they bad, or for that matter for consumers? And again, what are the ethics of tinkering with life in the first place? So what I would bring up is some of the applications of biotech. So in medicine, again, I mentioned insulin and other biological drugs. So these are things that clearly have a huge benefit for the patients that can get them. It's literally a matter of life and death. And so that's clearly a strong ethical benefit. The vaccines that we've all just experienced, how rapidly vaccines came to market. And one of the key ones was from a company called Moderna. You've probably all heard of it at this point. Moderna was very, let's just say it wasn't stealth, but nobody really knew about it because it was doing a very unusual thing in terms of how it creates the drugs that it does. And when I said at the beginning that there are four letters that are found in all life, the A, G, C, and T of DNA, well, they use additional letters. They've sort of introduced new letters into that alphabet to come up with their drugs and things as fast as they have. Diagnostics, organ replacement, these are things that are, diagnostics getting better, faster, cheaper. Organ replacement, in the future, if you have a heart attack, maybe you won't just get a stent, you might get a brand new heart altogether. So these are things that people are working on right now. Agriculture, I've mentioned, pest resistance was one of the first traits that people introduced into crops to basically help avoid the use of pesticides, but also make the plants stronger and more robust. So drought resistance and other types of properties that we might need if climate change keeps happening are things that are being worked on right now. There's also pharmaceuticals, the idea that we can actually grow medicines in foods. And I think one of the things we're seeing a lot about in the news these days is cell-based meats and other protein alternatives. So you can now today, in different cities and countries around the world, get chicken meat that was grown without chickens, or dairy products that were grown without cows, because the same proteins that constitute, for example, the muscle of meat, you can basically grow those cells from in a petri dish instead of having to raise an entire animal, kill it, and eat 5 or 10 or 20% of that animal. So ethically, that's a huge leap forward too, as well as environmentally. There are also industrial biotech. This is basically the ability to give, for example, wood waste or plants, feed them into microbes and have them churn out fuels and plastics, which is really just an acceleration of how we got the petrochemical-based fuels and plastics that we pull out of the ground. Those are just algae that lived and died millions of years ago and have stayed underground since then. So we can accelerate that process and actually take carbon out of the atmosphere in order to make those materials. And then on kind of an edgy topic, so people are also looking at DNA and proteins for data storage and processing or chemical sensing. So, as I mentioned, DNA is it's a data storage mechanism. It literally just encodes a series of signals, A, C, T, and G, kind of like bits and bytes. But people are looking at using DNA for long-term data storage. So encoding a song or a book or other type of thing into DNA, and then putting that DNA in a vial and keeping it that way. And we might talk a little bit about a company called Canary that is using living dogs, using their noses and really understanding how they interpret smells in their environment for things like chemical sensing, sniffing for bombs at a port or detecting other things. And we might have a chance to talk about that a little bit later. So lastly, to turn this into, what's happening, what's driving all this, not only is it scientific discovery, but it's investment. So investment drives the science drives the applications, and the applications bring in more money in a virtuous cycle. And in the last year, we've seen a huge bump up in investment in biotech. And a lot of that has been driven by needs that were caused by the pandemic, but other things have been breakthroughs, like I said, with cell-based meat. So that's driving a lot of interest in the space. And for the 2 quarters of this year, this is from a report that I did for an organization called SynBio Beta, investment in synthetic biology has been more than $4 billion per quarter. So comparing that to all of the years beforehand, we've been tracking this since about 2009. That's a huge leap up. And in fact, if that trend continues, it'll be more money raised for synthetic biology companies in 2021 than in all of the years since 2009 combined. So there's a lot going on, and I am very happy to have Pae Wu here to talk with us about that. So as we transition over to her, I hope this has given you some thoughts, some questions, and some things that you can ask us as we go into our conversation. And with that, we'll turn this over to Pae and JC and myself. All right, Pae, thanks for joining. You're on mute, by the way.
I'm good at technology.
Great.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so a little bit by way of introduction. I know Pae from some projects that we worked on together over the last roughly 2 or 3 years or so. And we recently switched places. So she's now in Silicon Valley. I'm in Barcelona about half the time, and there about half the time. So Pae, maybe you could just start out with a little bit of an intro on beyond the work that we did together. How did you, get into biotech in the first place? What's your background? What makes this an important topic for you?
Yeah, sure. I actually came to biotech a strange way. My background is not in biology at all. My PhD and postdoc were in electrical engineering. And I think the last time I officially studied biology was when I was about 14 years old. So I have had to learn a lot along the way. After working on some biosensors using semiconductors in my postdoc, I transitioned over to start consulting with DARPA, which is a US Department of Defense agency that's focused on creating disruptive technologies to prevent and cause technological surprise. And it was there where the internet was conceived of, and stealth technologies and handheld GPS. And so I joined there with an expectation I would be working on nanomaterials, nanotechnology, things like that. And then was lucky enough to have a front row seat and a hand in creating some of the first programs that the agency invested in for synthetic biology, which is the space that Mark gave a really nice summary of just now. So it was during that work where the field was really trying to overlay ideas from engineering, and in particular concepts that enabled computer chip production, and bringing that into the biological domain. And so my background in electrical engineering allowed me to make that switch. From there, it was a gradual transition into things like neurotechnology and finding different ways to just bridge between engineering and biology, and finding ways to control biology in a way that's useful and meaningful and improves lives. So that's how I got into biotech by accident.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I would say the same, and had a similar path. I was really working in information technology and focusing on, I never really thought biology was that interesting, to be honest. And then I had an elective class in biochemistry, and this encoding thing and the ability to measure and engineer more precisely was fascinating. So that was my transition into the space too. And so when a lot of people think about biotech, they think about living systems. They think about like wet and sticky and squishy. And can you talk a little bit about the stuff that might be outside of traditional life sciences, or outside of areas that you expected to be going into that you find exciting right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just the wet, sticky parts of biology that I find super interesting. It's the ways in which we can integrate it with technologies that we have a really good handle on today. This is obviously from my background in working in semiconductors and other types of functional materials that we can synthesize and do things with. And because of a growing understanding of how biology can actually react and respond and communicate using signals like electricity, like light, like mechanical signals and things like that, being able to leverage that and combine biology with these types of systems where we can read the information digitally, for example, just gives us much more control and an ability to do things that are useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in your role, as you look at these new discoveries and these new things that are so technically fascinating, at the same time, you're trying to help them get to market, to commercialize. And so a lot of times scientists aren't the best business people aren't the best scientists. Can you talk a little bit about, at IndieBio, or even more generally, how do you get stuff from the lab into the market or into hospitals or into the environment, like where it needs to be? What's that process like these days?
So yeah, we really do specialize in working with scientists who want to transition into entrepreneurship. Oftentimes these are folks who have a really good idea that was a discovery or an area that they became deeply expert in through their research. And oftentimes the ways to apply that knowledge and apply those scientific insights into the marketplace are a bit fanciful at first, but rooted in a scientific basis. And I think the biggest element of transition is to encourage scientists to dream a bit more about the possibilities, as well as connecting better with the actual user or recipient of the technology that would come from their science. Having an understanding of who that user is, where it's going to be used, what are the real practical implications of putting that technology into that use case, oftentimes really starts to hone how you think about what that technology needs to do. Because there are definitely things that we as scientists tend to do, which is how do we make a hero? I come from materials world, so you oftentimes we think about there's one characteristic, like the highest electron mobility semiconductor that you could ever make, and that's really exciting if you can make this record-breaking material. But if you can't grow that material at scale, for example, if you have to spend an inordinate amount of money for the raw materials to make that thing, those practical considerations will make it very difficult for that technology to really transition over. And so changing your priorities from getting to these hero best thing ever qualities that are often one-dimensional qualities, thinking more about the practicalities of getting it into the hands of a user is probably the biggest change that folks have to go through.
Yeah, the much shorter path to commercialization than the decades it used to take. So, well, I want to make sure JC or Ron, if you guys have any questions, because Pae and I could talk about this stuff for a long time. Anything that you want to pop in and ask?
I think JC's got the next one.
Sure. So, Pae, do you think are we living a revolution, like as transformative as the internet was in the late 90s?
Yeah.
Have we entered that space in biotech?
I think yes, I think it is, because biology affords us a completely different approach to all facets of like heavy industry, for example. So Mark mentioned, using biology to replace petrochemicals. And when you think about the scale at which petrochemicals, the scale that it plays both in our everyday lives and then as a measure of global GDP, the ability to really shift the way we think about the criticality of petroleum, for example, is one area in which I think biology has a genuine shot at bringing about something that's as revolutionary, like you are referring to as the internet, for example. We can really rethink what it means to be consumers and whether there has to always be a downside. Not that biology is like a perfect solution, but I think the opportunities to replace really energy intensive and harmful industries using biological approaches is where I feel the most optimism.
What about for entrepreneurs? So, on the internet revolution, you have all these entrepreneurs that usually say, why can't I buy, I don't know, pet food online? And then suddenly they start Petco and, and they make it big, right? Because they kind of, best entrepreneurs sometimes is like, I experience the problem, like the Airbnb guys, and then I use technology to solve the problem. Is there a limit on biotech for that? Meaning, do entrepreneurs need to be biotech people to do that? Or how easy is it to identify for a normal person to become an entrepreneur in biotech, to identify a problem that they can actually tackle, even with the help of, experts, right? Will that limit the democratization of entrepreneurship in biotech?
I don't think it limits it, because I think the key thing for anyone who wants to be an entrepreneur, who thinks that they want to bring about some change, be an innovator, probably the key quality is to have a maniacal focus on solving a problem. And that problem can be something as simple as, why can't I buy pet food online? Or why do I have to stay in hotels? Look at all these free couches that everybody has everywhere. Those are people who said, this is a dumb problem. Why does it still exist? What are the ways that we could overcome it? And I think, biology can be a solution to a lot of things. I don't think it's a panacea, but it is a solution. But an innovator, first and foremost, has to want to solve a problem. And then through that drive to solve that problem, and in combination with a deep curiosity and open-mindedness around what those solutions might be, that person, those people will talk to and integrate more and more knowledge and information into their thinking around that problem-solving process. And if biology, starts to look like a really positive solution, I think a true innovator is going to go and seek out partners in crime and people who can bring expertise in. It shouldn't be a blocker. It should only drive you to find people who can join you on the journey and solve that problem with you.
Could I just do a follow-up question on that? Because this whole question of like jobs and employment, and obviously that's something that resonates with our students who are on the cusp of their future careers. So in our group of schools, we have engineers for the most part, electrical engineers, but we also have students that are specializing in communication, in marketing, in business, and a wide array of different subjects. What are you seeing happening in this space? What would you say to someone who's 20 years old today and is thinking about getting into a variety of different fields? What does the field of biotech look like? And what are some of the profiles that you're seeing of people who are working in it? Obviously, there's the scientists, the core researchers, but who else is involved in this space?
Yeah, so our organization really does heavily bias towards people with technical backgrounds who are leading these organizations. But there are teams that are comprised of a mix. So there's often at least one technical expert who's forming the foundation of the company. And then there's often somebody who maybe comes from the industry that they're trying to disrupt. Maybe there are people who have a strong business background, experience in business, understand how to innovate around business models. It's not, technology in and of itself, it doesn't comprise an innovation until it actually makes it into the marketplace. And so having people on your team who understand how to take that technology and get it into the hands of users. Again, this goes back to, I think, what I mentioned earlier, which is understanding how to connect with who that user is going to be, who the customer is actually going to be. And that doesn't have to be a scientific expert necessarily. we do have teams who need marketing help, because sometimes the user is, a consumer who is buying online directly from their e-commerce site. And so there's absolutely expertise around marketing, around how to build consumer-facing brands, even though there's deep science behind that brand and behind the product that they're selling. So there's room for all sorts of qualities and expertise. It really comes down to, again, a commitment to solving the problem and wanting to know who you're serving in solving that problem.
Mark highlighted for us just the amount of investment going into this space. So I can imagine that this is also translating into, the activity within the space and the jobs that are there in the space. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're really seeing is faster growth of startups in the space, and a diversification of the types of application spaces where this technology is going. And so pulling in more, the sort of traditional view of biotech was that it was going to be medically focused. That was a lot of the really early work in the biotech space is medical, but now it touches all facets of life. It's not just medicine. It's not just chemicals. It's not just agriculture. Now we're seeing, one of our companies is a company that's making leather using fungus, so basically a type of mushroom. And that team was started by a couple artists who were really fascinated by this material that grows from fungi. And now they are in a partnership with Hermes, creating vegan leather bags that are stunning. And so, that is a company that started out with a couple artists, had to bring in some technical expertise, and then had to bring in some hardcore business folks who could help them really lock in these types of really critical partnerships. And then all the types of people that would support all those different functions, all the way down to creating a completely new manufacturing process and building out engineering lines and process lines to manufacture something that nobody had manufactured at scale before.
So what scares you most of the future of biotech?
I think probably I have two major concerns. One is letting the hype exceed the capability, and then causing a contraction in support for the space. And so what would be a real bummer would be if there's over-promising and under-delivering that causes the investor community and the partnerships to start drying up and causing us to, I think, under-invest in a really important space. So that's like kind of a big picture concern that I have, and I think when an area is getting so exciting, there is a lot of potential for exaggeration and hype that exceeds the reality. I think like scary science fiction things that I'm concerned about, with all of the excitement around how to deploy biological organisms to combat climate change. These are very large scale deployments that would be required in order to create discernible, meaningful impact on climate change, decreasing greenhouse gases, et cetera. And I think, I think one concern I have is around being in feeling the urgency to deploy very, very, very quickly, and having the unintended consequences create problems and harm. So that's
And
where
the other side of the coin.
Sorry?
What excites you most? The other side of the coin. What makes you really excited about being on this industry?
Yeah. So same thing, other side of the coin. I feel a great deal of optimism around how much biotech can be applied to the many problems that we're experiencing from a sustainability perspective and climate change perspective, and it's a huge lever that could be used in a space that feels at times overwhelmingly scary. And I guess the thing that keeps me going and getting up in the morning and wanting to find more companies and more innovators that are working in this space is because I think that there's a chance that we could actually make an impact on this big problem.
Great.
Hey,
well,
sorry. I was just going to say we're starting to get some questions coming in for Pae. If that's all right,
that's what I was going to say too. So you take it from here, Ron.
All right. One of the questions we got is about biomimetics. And I think that Mark brought it up like the dog's nose, inspiring us to go from there for a lot of practical reasons. And you spoke about replacing leather. How closely tied is the biotech field to biomimetics? Or are we also creating some things that are just going to be unimaginable, some things we've never seen?
Yeah, I think they are absolutely tied together. An example of where biomimetics is, making an impact on a climate-related issue. We have a company called Spintex that's producing silks that are of the same quality as natural silks. This is actually it's a hard problem. There have been other companies that have tried to make silk through biology, but not using silkworms. And they've done so using big giant vats of yeast to produce the silk proteins. But the quality has not been very, very good. And so this company, Spintex, is taking just a different approach. They're not trying to grow the proteins themselves. They're trying to, through their research at Oxford, they were able to build a tool that mimics how a spider actually spins silk. Because it's not just the protein that matters, it's how the proteins actually come together. And in the process of spinning the silk, the spider imparts new strength characteristics, and those characteristics haven't been able to be reproduced through other systems. And it was through this biomimicry that they were able to build basically a new way to spin silks mechanically, and to do so to get this high quality material that is also mimicking the natural material. What's really cool about that is, the silk industry is a very energy intensive process because it uses a lot of immense amounts of hot water to harvest the silk from silkworms today. And so their tool, again, if it scales, which they're working on, is a much lower energy process, and it gets really nice performing silks. And by taking that inspiration from nature, they were able to do that. And so biomimicry absolutely is fully in line with.
Excellent. I really like this next question because it's mixing our exploration in outer space to our exploration here on Earth. And the question is, what does research into biotech in outer space, does that in any way impact our research here on Earth?
Yeah.
These experiments up in the space station and
In
all
the space station. Yeah. So, of very one aspect that in that realm that is really important is actually understanding better about human longevity and the aging process, and being able to do those types of experiments in space allows you to get a type of data that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get on Earth. I like to think a little bit about maybe the reverse direction, which is by thinking about space and by thinking about what a future of space exploration would require. It's actually seeding technologies that could be absolutely relevant today, here on Earth. Again, when we think about sort of this looming climate crisis, and one of those examples is all the work that NASA has spent money on research in terraforming. And so, the idea that, maybe one day we'll have to bounce off this planet and potentially live on Mars. I don't know I don't know when that's going to happen. And so, terraforming sounds fanciful right now, but there are absolutely elements of that are going to be relevant here on Earth as.
Could you just give us a quick definition of terraforming for those in the audience that may not be aware of it?
Yeah, so using technologies that can take otherwise non-arable land and make it something that's more like earth and land that we'd want to use to be able to grow crops. That's like the first key problem that you'd need to solve if you were going to get off this planet. And so those types of technologies will absolutely be relevant here as we think about where global populations will have to live and whether arable land will continue to exist in where it is now, or how we need to remediate land that's been overused and things like that. So they're very practical implications, even for things that sound like science fiction.
Great.
Yeah, Pae, I wanted, we've got about 7 minutes left, so that would be probably 2 questions, and I wanted to get one in and make sure we did. The group here, the audience, is students, and so they're just entering their careers, or maybe they're looking for a mid-career transition. So I was wondering, classic question, do you have any advice for people who have said, wow, that stuff Pae said was amazing. What do I do tomorrow morning, or what do I do later tonight? What should they look at? Where should they go to learn? What's a good next step?
Well, I think if you're interested in biotech, there's no shortage of exciting news coming out of labs today and really interesting startups today. And I think there are a lot of really good publications that are well suited to lay readers, and in there you'll be able to see where some of the cool new solutions are coming out. So MIT Tech Reviews is really great. The Economist has a really great technology section as well. There are journals called Science and Nature, which have interesting perspective pieces in them. So I think, fortunately, the popular press has also really gotten on the train. So there's a lot to really quickly educate yourself on around what's possible and where neat technologies are happening, especially in biotech. I think that's probably the best answer I can give.
Yeah. Well, I'll give also an answer, and I actually only thought of this after I asked you. It was not meant to be a leading question, but so you and I will both be at this conference in Paris in a few weeks. So there's an event called Hello Tomorrow that is taking place in Paris on the 2nd and 3rd of December. And I think they've done a great job of integrating students, entrepreneurs, investors, corporations. And it's a lot of fun. It's a really well done event. So if you're in Paris and you're interested, I would say check out Hello Tomorrow, and there's a link to that in the notes as well.
The other thing I'll add is with biotech growing, gaining popularity today, look around. I don't know if people still use Meetup, but I think there are meetup groups everywhere I've lived. There have been, meetup groups for different types of groups of people who are interested in different types of technologies. Obviously, here in San Francisco, there's like several biotech focused meetup groups. These are like thousands of people, large groups. Growing number of events. Oftentimes these DIY hacker spaces, like the ones that Mark mentioned, are a really good place to just start interacting with people who are already in the space and learning more.
Ron or JC, do you want to take the last question?
Well, I just said learning, right? And I think, Mark, you have an interesting story. You weren't in biotech at the beginning of your career. And I remember a time that you were just learning and absorbing. So how was that journey? Because it seems to be, in order to find solutions in any industry, you kind of have to know how it works. What kinds of solutions this type of technology can solve, right? Otherwise, so what was your journey?
Well, that's more of a question for me than for Pae, but so I didn't want to integrate her into this. But she had a similar, I think, experience where, well, you asked the question earlier about, if you have a problem finding a place to sleep, you start Airbnb, or if you find you want to buy dog food online, you can do that. But those require skills that are technical, and they're, the idea of like, I'm gonna, program a computer so that anybody in the world can view this thing that I made and actually transact money and do that stuff. Those are all very similar to problems in biology. So you do have to have some degree of technical knowledge, but I think because the field keeps moving just as it does in information technology, is you mostly have to have that curiosity. And so when somebody says, hey, we've just learned a way to make precision edits in genes, like, oh, okay, that could solve a few things that I can see where that would work, but I also need to learn a little bit about it. So the reason I jumped, to be honest, from information technology to biotech was I see it changing at a lot faster rate and a lot more impact than even in the internet and the things that you said. It's how we live, it's what we eat, it's the materials that we use to build everything with. So you can only do so much with information about those things before you have to actually change the things themselves. So that would be me. Pae, what would you add on that?
I think the key aspect is having a curiosity around how these things work, whether it's an industry, whether it's a technology, and then like being open to learning this stuff is also super key. And then the last thing I'm not sure that I agree with you, Mark, that things are happening faster. I think I frequently take time to think about and try and understand the history of how discoveries are made, because without exception, we will find that any technology that has become ubiquitous today had a very long multi-decades arc that involved lots of interesting insights and discoveries, and then execution along the way. CRISPR is a perfect example of that. You brought that up in your talk, Mark. CRISPR is a technology that, in 2012, the seminal paper on using it as a precision gene editing technology was published in Science. And that was really the culmination of about 30 years of prior work in understanding the core elements that comprise CRISPR. And so that, and not forgetting that there is that long process that precedes it, is, I think, an important thing for people to keep in mind. it's
True. All right.
Great.
Well, I know we have a lot of hard stops right now. So Ron, pass it over to you to wrap up.
I would
Thank you very much, Pae.
I would just like to thank Pae so much for joining us. As always, thank you, JC and Mark. I feel as though in one short hour, we were able to cover a lot of ground. Mark, thank you for that great introduction. And I kind of feel like I was going to say 1995, but after what Pae just said, maybe a little bit later in the 90s, I feel like compared to IT and internet, like what's happening in biotech, it's a very exciting time. And thank you guys for kind of bringing us up to speed, even though it's just a quick introduction. I hope that all of our students pay close attention to this space because it is fast evolving and exciting with tremendous stakes. I was very interested in that Pae. I always think about like longevity, about human health and all that. And a lot of what she was talking about was also climate change and our environment as a whole. So obviously this is a tremendously exciting subject, and thank you to the three of you for making it so.
Okay, take care everyone. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.